Alexander III's empire. Following his father's assassination, Alexander III, who ruled from 1881 to 1894, was in no mood to contemplate any liberalization by imperial institutions. Public opinion existed in the Russian Empire, but mass political life did not. The assassination of his father led to a curtailment of the powers of the Zemstvos. Judicial authority shifted to the police, putting political trials in the hands of military courts. For the moment, exile was the only safe place from which to criticize the autocracy. Small colonies of political refugees, most of whom were socialists, lived in Geneva, Paris, and London. Professors and teachers were brought under stricter state control, and tuition was increased to discourage commoners from going to school. The police could arrest and imprison anyone without reason. The resulting political trials may have actually helped the cause of reformers and revolutionaries by serving as tribunals where the autocratic regime was discussed and political issues were brought into the open. What went on in courtrooms helped shape Russian opinion, even when political trials were moved into military courts. The Russian Empire late in the 19th century was enormous, more than 100 times the size of Great Britain and 3 times larger than the United States, to which Russia had sold Alaska in 1867. Its population doubled from about 74 million inhabitants in 1861 to about 150 million by 1905. It was now comprised of almost 200 nationalities who spoke 146 languages. Russians made up 40% of the population of the empire. Ukrainians, Poles, and Belarusians made up the next largest national groups, followed by Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Finns, Romanians in Bessarabia, Crimean Tatars, Armenians, Georgians, Azeri in the Caucasus, and the Muslim peoples of Central Asia. Alexander ordered a vigorous campaign of Russification in the Western Empire. The Tsar banned the use of languages other than Russian in school and forbade publication in, for example, the Ukrainian language, despite the fact that it was spoken by 25 million people. At the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church launched campaigns against non-Orthodox religions, which held the allegiance of almost a third of the people of the empire. New laws enforced restrictions against Jews, who in principle were supposed to be confined to the Pale of Settlement in Poland. In 1899, the Finnish assembly was reduced to a consultative voice, and Russians replaced Finns in most key administrative positions. Russification firmed the resolve of nationalist groups to persevere in their demands for recognition. In Russian Poland, opposition grew more daring. Poles were linked by long-standing cultural bonds based on language and Catholicism. Polish identity had survived the end of an independent Poland with the Third Partition of 1795 by Russia, Austria, and Prussia, which is now Germany today. Moreover, the cause of Polish independence had been kept alive by Poles forced to flee abroad after the ill-fated insurrections of 1831, and the majority of the population of the Russian Empire was poor. The average per capita income was now more than 4 times higher in Britain, 3 times higher in Germany, and twice as high in the Balkan states. This would lead to unrest, the requirements for reform, and in the end, revolution. If, by 1910, 70% of children aged 7 to 11 were likely to attend school for at least 1 year, about 60% of the population remained illiterate. In 1897, only 1% of the population had attended secondary school for any amount of time. That would be high school. Yet, literacy in European Russia and the Baltic region in particular was rising, and with it the number of people who wanted reform. The reading public grew dramatically in size around the turn of the century, especially in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Even seasonal workers and peasants migrating to Siberia began to carry books with them. The taste for literature expanded from religious books and the emerging classics of the Russian literary tradition, above all Gogol and Tolstoy, to relatively liberal magazines and newspapers. Liberals had played a role in the expanding domain of Russian public opinion since the heady days of the 1860s and the emancipation of the serfs. The Russian army's poor performance in the war against Turkey, 1877 to 1878, proved that military reforms instituted following the Crimean War had been inadequate. Expanding opportunities for education, increased government bureaucratization, and industrial development increased the professional middle class. Thus, combined with the expansion of heavy and light industry and urban growth, seemed to make autocracy an anachronism, means something that should be left in the past. Liberals, including a smattering of gentry, leaders of local assemblies, the Zemstovos and municipal dumas, and above all members of the professional classes, including economists, Zemstovo agronomists, physicians, lawyers, teachers, and students. Some state bureaucrats, too, sought a middle way between state and noble intransigence and revolutionary insurgentry, hoping that the Tsar would grant political reforms to complement the gradual modernization of the Russian economy. Some were encouraged by laws slightly reducing the long workday, 1897, and providing the first factory insurance law, 1903. Liberals in the Union of Liberation demanded an extension of the powers of the Zemstovos, whose limited authority had been curtailed in 1890, but imagined little more than active consultation between those bodies and the Tsar. New revolutionary groups, however, still believed the autocracy incapable of reforming itself, and that only revolution could bring reform. The populist social revolutionaries became the largest radical group, with growing support among peasants, whom socialist revolutionaries, like some of their optimistic predecessors, believed would one day overthrow the Tsar. In the meantime, national movements developed in Poland, Finland, Ukraine, and the Baltic region. In the distant Muslim reaches of the empire, religion proved a new cohesiveness. Marxists founded the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party in 1898. They were confident that one day, though probably not in their lifetimes, the Russian proletariat would be sufficiently numerous and class-conscious to seize power. But this seizure of power could only occur, they believed, after a democratic revolution had successfully overthrown the Russian autocracy. Marxists claimed vindication for their view that peasants had no true revolutionary potential when, despite the terrible suffering and deaths of millions of peasants during the famine that followed the severe drought and epidemics of 1891 and 1892, the countryside remained quiescent, or quiet, without rebellion. By 1900, the Tsar's police had succeeded in disbanding most of the revolutionary groups within the empire, deporting their leaders to join the groups in exile, sending them to Siberia, or putting them in prison. Most revolutionaries shared a belief that their country was far from revolution.